Hello, welcome back. Thank you so much for being here. Today we're going to be playing with the new Natasha Denona Mini Rose eyeshadow palette. So this has just launched, I believe as of today. It is now available at retailers, Sephora, Ulta, Beautylish. So nothing makes me happier than a good Natasha Denona review, and I feel like it hasn't been that long since the Golden palette, but I'm still very excited to get into this one. So this palette is her usual $28 US or 40 Canadian. This does have a 24-month shelf life. It is made in Italy, and it does come in her newer packaging, which has the window where you can see the palette. And this is kind of like a chromy pink, which is kind of pretty. So her description on this palette is to celebrate last year's mini Starlit eyeshadow palette, which was a big hit from its launch till this very day. I'm launching this charming and cool toned pink beauty inspired by the rosy hues of my Rosy Cheek Duo and I Need a Rose lip collection. This 5-shade constellation includes 3 creamy mattes, 1 duochrome, and 1 sparkling foiled. Perfect for creating soft, everyday to bold statement rose glam looks. So let's take a look at the palette. So there we have the color story, and it's just plastic. It's not that soft touch matte feel or anything like that. But the color story of this one looks very pretty. This has been met with some mixed reviews, I will say, because these are all repeat shades. 3 of these shades are in the retro palette and 2 of them are from her original 28 pan palettes. I don't have any of the 28 pans, but I do have the retro, so I will show you side by side a little later on. For now, let's take a look at some swatches. First, we have the shade Golden Rose, which is supposed to be like a duochrome. It's got a pink gold shift. It is a very soft shift though. And Golden Rose was from one of the 28 pan palettes. Then we have Opart, which is a matte, and this was originally in the retro palette as a cream to powder. Then we have Flamingo, which was also in one of the 28 pan palettes, and this is a matte. Then we have Psychedelic, which is a chroma crystal, and this is in the retro palette. I find it interesting though because in her description on Instagram, she said Psychedelic was a sparkling foiled formula, which is my absolute favorite formula from Natasha. But now that I have the palette and I've swatched the shade, she's saying it's a chroma crystal, which I'm pretty sure it was in the retro as well. And then finally we have Andy, which is a matte, which was originally a cream to powder in the retro palette as well. So the color story itself looks really beautiful. Like I said, I'm a little disappointed that she described Psychedelic as a sparkling foiled in her Instagram, but it's actually a chroma crystal because they are different formulas. That might not bother everyone, but for some reason that bothers me a little bit. But let me zoom you in. We're going to create 2 different looks with this palette, and then I will show you some comparisons and give you my final thoughts. So I have been very excited for this palette because I think it's absolutely beautiful. The rest of my makeup is already on. I should have probably used her Mini Rose Trio today, but it didn't occur to me until it was too late. So we're just going to go into the palette. I'm going to start with the shade Flamingo right here, and I think I'm going to put this one all over the lid to start. I do just have concealer and powder on my eyes. It's kind of late in the day, so I figured I wouldn't really bother with a proper primer. And Flamingo is actually just a really nice shade for me if I wanted to set my primer if I was using any, because it just kind of cancels everything out on the lid. It's very soft, but it really doesn't add any color to my lids. Next, I'm going to take Andy, which is actually one of my very favorite shades from the retro palette. Andy and Psychedelic both are favorite shades of mine from retro, so I'm excited to see them in here as well. The retro is actually one of my very favorite Natasha palettes, so I still reach for that one all the time. I love that palette. I love a good mauve color story. This one is obviously leaning into the rose a little bit more, but I still think it's very beautiful. I kind of like Andy as a regular matte. Just a really beautiful shade. I like her creamed powder formula a lot as well, but sometimes a standard matte is kind of nice. I do still wish Psychedelic was going to be a sparkling foil because that is my absolute favorite formula from Natasha. It's just the most, like the name would suggest, a sparkling foil, but it's so intensely sparkly and beautiful, and there's minimal fallout. I love that formula so much. But the Chroma Crystal formula is beautiful as well. And I'm just starting to take Andy all over the lid a little bit as well. I'm kind of copying a look I saw her do, I think on Instagram. Not copying it fully because she definitely does makeup a lot differently than I do, but definitely taking inspiration. From there, I'm going to grab a smaller shader brush and I'm going to grab Opart, which was also a cream to powder in the Retro palette. And this is the only deepening shade we get in here. So just keep that in mind. I will say I did look at this one side by side, the Starlit palette, which came out last year, and I loved this Starlit palette. It definitely leans a little bit more peachy than this one, but the one thing about the Starlit palette is that there's not a lot of depth to it, whereas Opart actually will give you a fair amount of depth. Not a ton, I'm not going for a ton right now, but it will give you some. And I'm just kind of using that to build a little bit more depth. I think I might grab just a little bit more of Andy. I think Opart is a really beautiful liner shade in here too. Now I'm just going to pick up Psychedelic on a finger. And because it's a Chroma Crystal, it is so shiny and sparkly. Her normal Chroma Crystal shades don't really have much of a base. I would say this one actually has a little bit more of a base to it than the one in the Retro palette. They're the same shade, but I feel like this has a little bit more of a base to it somehow. Or maybe I just picked up a little bit more than I normally would. I love this shade so much. This shade's been one of my favorites ever since I got the Retro, just because I think it's so soft and pretty. This would have probably been pretty just with this and Andy, but that is how that look turned out. Just kind of really keeping it very soft. I don't want to do anything too crazy. I probably could have left Opart out altogether, but I did want to get a little bit of depth there, and I think that's quite pretty. Let me pop on some mascara and then we'll get into look number 2. Okay, so here is the finished look number 1. I think it's really pretty. I did get a little bit of fallout from Psychedelic, but that's okay. I think it's quite pretty. That's a very, very soft, very me look, but it's very, very wearable and easy. Again, I could have skipped Opart altogether, but I did want a little bit of that depth, and I just kind of wanted to play with that shade as well. Let's get into look number 2. I actually am going to start the same way. And as I'm playing with this palette, perhaps it's just me, but I feel like there's really not a lot of different looks that we're going to be able to create with this palette. I think they are always going to be some version of this, because as I'm looking at trying to figure out what to do for look number 2, I could definitely play with Opart a little bit more, really dig into those browns, but thinking about it, I'm not 100% sure the looks are always going to come out the most different and varied. But I am going to go back into Andy, and I think I might want to do sort of like a halo situation with this one. So I think I'm going to blend Andy. I am going to grab a smaller brush because I want to do that inner corner as well. And I'm just going to kind of pack Andy right here. And then going back in with my 202, working on that outer corner, and that outer edge, blending up just a little bit. I just always think Andy's like the most perfect mauve-y shade. It's just such a beautiful, beautiful tone. It's purple, but it's not intense. I think as much as I love doing my full face of makeup, there's just something magic about eyeshadow. It's just, I feel like the most creative, artsy part. And that's what I love. Okay, now I'm gonna grab Golden Rose, and I'm gonna grab this one on a finger, and this one is going to go directly in the center. That's really pretty. That's quite pretty. Can you see the sort of halo effect going on there? Maybe a little. Not a ton, but maybe a little. I think I'm gonna add a little bit of psychedelic right to the middle. Not all over, but like right. I'll look straight ahead and right in the center. Did that give it a little bit more life? Maybe a little bit. I am gonna grab just an eyeliner brush. This is the BK Beauty 208. I like this one just because it's so tiny and it's angled. I'm not gonna do anything too intense, but I am going into O-part with that brush. And I just wanna lightly stamp this along the lash line. I don't normally do this for a halo eye, but I just think it might be nice to get a little extra. And I'm just really tight lining this, like I'm keeping it very close to the lash line. So that is what that looks like. Kind of like look number one the most. I like how this one's really soft, but this one's just lighter, more ethereal. I even think it would have been pretty with just psychedelic in the middle. Maybe we need more psychedelic. Let's see. Ooh. That brought it to life a little bit. A little more psychedelic. We could even try O-part for the halo, but I think it's a pretty soft halo eye, but I do think I like this one more. Let me pop on some mascara and then I'll be right back. We'll get into some comparisons and I'll share my final thoughts. All right, so here is the finished look number two. I think it's quite pretty. I do, again, prefer the first look, but I do think they're both quite pretty and I'm happy with them. So let me zoom you out and share some comparisons. Okay, so before I hop into the comparison with the retro palette, I did just want to show you the side-by-side with the Starlit palette from last year. And you can kind of see how the Starlit is much more into those peachy warm tones, whereas Mini Rose is definitely much more cool leaning and pink. I do think you do get more depth with the Mini Rose, but I mean, not a ton. I also wanted to share the Mini Love side by side because there were certain similarities that kind of stuck out to me, the way that they're both, you know, very pink, but the Mini Love is actually quite a bit more intense than the Mini Rose, so I really didn't feel like they compared very much either. Now, getting into the retro palette, so definitely inspired by one another. I feel like if there wasn't already a Mini Retro, this could have been the Mini Retro. I think it's very, very pretty. So psychedelic in here. So psychedelic right here. We have Andy. And then we have O-part. So this little group of three right here, these are the repeat shades. However, when I swatched them out, I believe I brought in Vivian and Glitz. Now, Glitz wasn't identical, but swatched out side by side, you'll be able to see from the photos that if you have retro, you absolutely don't need Mini Rose, because even though we are missing two shades from the Mini Rose, I feel like I got it close enough that on the eyes, you're not at all going to notice the difference. So I do think if you have the retro palette, just stick with the retro. You definitely don't need the Mini Rose. I did pull the Love palette from Natasha Denona as well, because the shade Giving kind of made me think of Golden Rose, and that it's got that pinky golden kind of shift, but this one is quite a bit more intense. It's quite a bit more shimmery and shifty. It definitely has much more of a duochrome effect to it than Golden Rose from the Mini Love. I was also initially drawn to the Huda Beauty Rose Quartz, given that they are both very rosy color stories, but I feel like they weren't nearly as similar as I thought. I thought Rose Quartz would be great because it has these rosy tones, but it does have these shades that have more of a purple shift to it, much like Andy does. But like I said, they really weren't as similar as I thought. Keeping in line with my rosy palettes, I did pull the Sigma New Mod, and There were some similarities, there wasn't a ton. However, the new mod obviously can create some very similar looks. You're definitely going to be missing out on the very light ethereal pink of Psychedelic with new mod, so that's one of the major differences. It was more so the mattes that were similar but nothing else. In terms of vibe and effect, similar, but again, you're gonna miss out on that really light, bright, ethereal pink of Psychedelic. And the last palette I pulled is the Patrick Ta Major Dimension 2 Rose palette, because this is probably the rosiest palette I have, and you can see, I think, at least from these top shades, it is quite well loved. And again, there are definitely some tonal differences, but I feel like you could also create something very, very similar with the Major Dimension 2. It is warmer, and you don't necessarily get that purple of Andy, and even the shades that I compared to the shimmers are a little bit more intense, but I do think you could get something very similar from the Patrick Ta. So I mean, if you have any of these rosy palettes, if you have a lot of rosy palettes in general, you're probably safe to skip the Mini Rose. That being said, if you just think it's super beautiful, you love the color story, maybe you don't have the retro because you don't want to splurge on one of her larger midi palettes, which totally fair, this could be a really great way to fill that gap in your collection. I mean, this is essentially a collection of some of my very favorite shades from the retro. So I do think this palette is very, very beautiful. It's just one of those that isn't really a necessity. I do think a lot of people are going to have these shades in their collection already. I mean, I'm a little disappointed that they're all repeat shades, but at the same time, I love Natasha Denona. I would have bought it anyway, so I'm not going to complain too much on that. I do think it's a beautiful color story. I will definitely reach for it a lot. I still don't think you're going to get a lot of variation in terms of the different looks. I will be trying more looks, trying to bring Opart into it a little bit more, just to maybe see if I can change it up, but I really don't think I'm going to get a lot of variation. I think they're always going to look like some variation of the two looks I have on today. That's fine with me, but it's just something to note that you're not going to get a ton of variation with this palette. I do think Opart gives this palette more depth than was in the Mini Starlit, which I do think is a good thing. Overall, I think this is a really pretty palette. I'm glad I have it. I will definitely get a lot of use out of it, and I will definitely love it. But it's definitely one of those that you could safely skip, like I said, if you have the retro or you just have a lot of rosy palettes in your collection in general. You could definitely skip this one and really not be missing out on anything. But I do still think it's very pretty, and if you don't already own the retro or you just don't have a ton of rosier toned palettes, maybe this is a great one. Or if you're just looking to slowly dip your toes into more pinky rosy eyeshadow, this is a great starter. I think it's really, really beautiful. And I think I said the price was $28 US. It's actually 27. So I think it's really, really pretty. It's just not a need. It's one of those, it's beautiful. It's excellent quality. I love the looks I created. I will get a lot of use out of this palette, but definitely consider your own collection, what your own collection looks like, and your preferences before grabbing this one, because it might be very redundant. If you do want to pick this up and you're shopping on the Natasha Denona website, you can use my code Christy, and that will save you 15%. You don't have to, it's just there if you want it. If you do, I thank you so, so much. But if you're a Canadian, I do recommend Beautylish because it's usually a few dollars cheaper and shipping's free. So just keep that in mind. If you are Canadian, go with Beautylish. But that is it for me today. Let me know all of your thoughts down below. Are you picking this one up? Are you passing? What are your thoughts? I just love hearing from you guys so, so much. I'm also still very, very impressed that we got a Natasha palette kind of out of nowhere without it being leaked. I had no idea. I just opened my phone the other day and there it was, and I was so excited. I didn't even know how to act. I was so excited. But that is it for me today. Again, let me know all of your thoughts down below. If you're new here, I hope you'll consider subscribing before you go. I do upload new videos every single week. Thank you again so very much for watching, and I will see you in my next one. Bye!